Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. An English friend of mine who's an antique dealer calls this a pantry table because that's where it would most likely be found. But I'm not going to put this piece in the pantry. I'm going to use it as a bedside table, or perhaps a TV stand or small writing desk. I'll show you where we found this antique and how to build one of these next, right here on the new Yankee Workshop. If you're mad about antiques, then you owe yourself a visit to Britain, where I think there are more antique shops per square inch than any place else on the planet. And this is what I found. This table would be just right as an end table for a sofa, or maybe even a hall table. It reminds me a bit of shaker pieces because it has a tapered leg, has a center drawer with this little beaded detail around the edge, which I kind of like, and a wooden knob. And the top is just the right size. Now I know that this is a pretty simple project to build, and also it'll fit in just about anybody's home. Well, I like that antique pantry table so much that I actually bought it and had it shipped back here to the workshop. And it certainly made developing the prototype a lot easier having the original. Now, I kept the proportions pretty much the same, but one important detail was the thickness of the top. You see here on the original, it's only about 5/8 of an inch thick. Now, even though my prototype has a 3/4 inch thick top, the edge looks thinner, and I'll show you how I accomplished that later. One thing I did add, though, was a breadboard edge. And I did that because the antique original is built from old-growth pine, which is pretty stable. But today's more quickly grown pines tend to want to warp and twist. So the addition of the breadboard edge will add some stability to that top. Also, before we get started, I want to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now, one thing that I've started to do with every single project I make is take the time to size up the boards for thickness. Now, here are 3 boards that are going to become our top. And straight out of the lumberyard, even if I was to cut all the boards from the same length of material, I sometimes get variations in the thickness. And what that means is when you glue them up for a panel, there's unevenness, and you could spend a lot of time sanding. So it only takes a few minutes to run each board through the surface plane. With all the boards the same thickness, I've now arranged them with the wide board in the center, and I've taken the time to look at the ends to make sure I alternate the growth rings. The growth rings on this board arch up, this one they're down, this one they're up. Now with them arranged, I'll just key each joint so I can make sure the boards get assembled this way all the time. And now look at the joint edge. And you can see here that there's a little bit of unevenness there. I don't want to use clamps to pull this together. I want the edges to butt tightly without any pressure. So now I'll turn to the joiner feature of my tool. Before I apply any glue, I want to cut some slots for these hardwood biscuits that are going to go along the joint line to add some reinforcement. Now, to lay out for each biscuit slot, it's just a simple matter of drawing a line across the joint, every 6-7 inches apart. Now, for the assembly, I'm going to start by rolling some glue on the edge of each board. And then I'm going to turn to this tool, which is actually made by the manufacturer of the biscuit joiner that I've been using. It's a glue bottle, and on the end of it, there's this little device. You can see a couple holes here where there's some glue coming out. It goes all the way through, and it's made to fit in the slot for a number 20 biscuit. And all I have to do is push on it, and it'll inject the right amount of glue for the biscuit slot. It really saves me a lot of time in having to brush each slot with glue. Now we'll just slip a biscuit in each slot, and we'll be able to assemble it and clamp it. Okay, and we'll set this aside to dry. Now here are 4 blanks for the legs on our table, and they're 1.5 inches square. Now I'm ready to cut them to length. First I'm going to square up an end. And now I'll cut it to the correct length, and this is where a saw stop comes in handy. I've set it at 29 inches, and I know that every leg will be exactly the same. Let's take a look at our prototype. The legs are tapered, and that's typical of a piece like this because it makes the piece appear a little lighter and it makes it more graceful. Now the tapers always occur on the inside edges, so there's one along this inside edge and one along this inside edge, the outside corner being the straight part. Now from this point up, the leg remains straight. The taper will start right here with the full 1.5 inches and go down to about 1 1/8 inches. And that's what I've laid out on this blank. Now to make the taper, I'm going to use my tapering jig at my table saw. The tapering jig is just a couple pieces of metal that pivot for varying degrees of taper and a little stop against which I will rest the blank. Now I think that the easiest way to set it up is to simply put everything in position and using my tape measure against the rip fence, check the measurement where the taper starts and where it ends, and keep making adjustments until they're equal. Then I know that the layout line is parallel to the saw blade. Okay, with the taper angle correctly set, now I have to slide the whole assembly over. And basically by eye, I'm going to just leave a little space between the blade and where the taper starts. So I'll have some extra material to plane later, and then we can run them through. Now the joiner does a nice job cleaning up the saw marks. In looking at the original pantry table, it appeared that the rails were joined to the legs with mortise and tenon joinery, a more than acceptable way to make that connection. But we're going to do something a little different today. I'm going to make that connection using a series of these hardwood biscuits, and it should be just as strong. So over here I've set up the 3 boards which will become the wide rails, and laid out biscuit locations. I'm going to take my biscuit joiner, which has been set up to put a slot approximately in the center of a 3/4 inch board, flip this guide fence into the vertical position, and put on this little attachment, which will allow me to position the biscuit just about any place I want. It has a slight calibrated area here. I want to start at a 1/4 inch. Now that 1/4 inch corresponds to the distance from the base of this plate to the center of the saw blade. And what I want to do is cut 4 slots, 2 from each side. Now before I can make the corresponding slots in the legs themselves, I'm going to have to make an adjustment to the biscuit joiner because these rails sit in 1/8 of an inch from the face of the leg. Okay, one more adjustment. And we can finish the rest of the slots for the rails. On the draw side of our table, there are two rails, one at the top and one at the bottom, a little bit narrower, but they're flush with the leg, still attached with biscuits, except this time I'm going to have to go to a smaller biscuit. So I'll have to make some adjustments to the tool. First, I'm going to take off this accessory fence, tip this back down into the horizontal position, and snap on this spacer plate that comes with the tool. Now I'm going to use a number 0 biscuit for this connection, and it is actually longer than the rail is wide. So I'm going to offset the center point a bit because I don't want the biscuit showing through the face side of the table. Now in the assembly process, I'll trim off the excess. I want 2 slots, one at the top and one at the bottom of each rail end. Each leg needs 4 corresponding slots, 2 for the upper rail and 2 for the lower rail. Without making any further adjustments to the tool, I can cut one of those slots. To cut the remaining slots, I'm going to remove my spacer piece, tip my fence back up, and use this edge and this indicator mark on some layout lines to cut the rest of the slots. Now the draw rides on a hardwood support with a side guide and also an upper guide which keeps the draw from tipping out too much as it's opened. All those are joined to the rails and to each other with more biscuit slots. I'm ready to make one of the draw support assemblies. The glue is already on the edge. Now a little bit in each of the slots. We'll install some biscuits and clamp it up. Well, now we'll make a couple sub-assemblies of the front and back rails of the table. I want to make sure that I get absolute 100% coverage. Now, the trick here is to move quickly enough to get the assembly together before the glue dries up. Now here on the back rail sub-assembly, I'm back to my number 20 biscuits, so I can use my glue applicator. Well, now is when I trim off the excess biscuit on the front assembly. This is the point when you wish you had about 7 sets of hands with all the biscuits and slots glued, ready to start the final assembly of the base. That's the top draw guide, and the draw support. Now we'll set this base aside to dry and get back to work on the top. Now over here at the table saw with my stacked dado head cutter set up, I'm ready to make a tongue on the ends of the blank to accept the breadboard edge. Carefully removing a little bit of the tongue at each corner because I don't want this to show through on the end grain of the breadboard edge. To make the corresponding groove in the breadboard edge, I'll use my router table, which is set up with a 1/4-inch spiral bit, and I've put some indicator marks to show the leading and trailing edge. Now what I'm going to do is take my piece, which has a mark where I want the groove to start, drop it down over the leading edge mark, push it through till I hit the trailing edge, remove it, turn it around and do the same thing so that the groove will be perfectly centered. Now I'm not going to cut the whole depth at once, just about half in the first pass. Now, by simply removing this 3/8 inch shim has the effect of raising the bit to 3/4 of an inch, and now I can finish the grooves. With the breadboard edges lightly clamped in place, I'm slipping a piece of scrap wood underneath the area where I'm going to drill some holes for some dowel pins, and that'll prevent any splintering as the drill bit pushes its way through. Now, the center hole in each tongue I'm not going to touch. But the outer holes I want to elongate by drilling a hole on each side. Now what this will do is allow this field of the top to expand and contract freely along the breadboard edge with changing temperature and humidity, thus preventing it from ever cracking. Now the center dowel is secured with some glue. I can actually put glue in the hole and on the dowel. Now here's how the end dowel pins work. No glue to start. Just drive the pin in so it's almost through. Then just put a little spot of glue right at the joint line right here, and then we'll just tap it in a little bit more, and that will assure me that this pin will not fall out. Now to make that top look a little bit thinner on the edge, I've got the bottom side facing up, and I've put a line on the edge and a line on the back, and I'm just going to use my block plane to thin it down at a slight taper. Well, I think that that's all I'm going to do today. Tomorrow we'll install this top and make the drawer. When I pre-drill the holes for the screws which will hold the top on, I like to make sure that they're elongated so that the top will be able to move freely if it has to. I've just made a 1/2 inch wide, 1/4 inch deep groove in the side piece which receives the drawer back. Now for the drawer bottom, I'm going to change to a 1/4 inch width dado and groove the sides and the front. Now using my dovetailing jig and my router, which is equipped with a collar and a dovetailing bit, I'm able to make the pins and the tails that connect the drawer front to the side. Now we'll slip in the bottom. That's not bad. The Antique Original had a nice little detail around the edges of the drawer front. It's like a little kerf. Now, if they had made a kerf along the end grain, it probably would have just chipped off, so they went through the trouble of running a thin piece along the width of the drawer. And I carried out the same details on the prototype, and I'll show you how. Here I've installed a straight edge clamp about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the drawer. And what I'm going to do is use a sharp utility knife to just score it about 1/16 of an inch deep. Now I'm just going to readjust the clamp the width of the kerf and score it again. The next step is to take a very thin piece of wood, line it up with the edge of the score line, and reset the clamp. The reason for the shim is that, so as I use my back saw, the teeth will not be against the metal, they'll be against the wood as I remove the material between the score lines. Now for the end detail, which is done with a combination square and the sharp utility knife. First, I'm just going to score a little miter to the edge of the groove on each corner. Now I score the groove across the grain. And now the depth of the groove across the end. I'm going to come in about 1/8 of an inch from the end to remove material for that little thin strip that I have to install. And for the cut along the edge, I want to be right at the tip of the tails. And all this really is a little bit of time-consuming carving, but the end results are really worth it. That little thin strip that's going to be on the end gets mitered at the corners, and we keep cutting it and trimming it until it fits just right. There. Now we're ready for some finish. In an effort to get that wonderful country pine look, I'm applying a coat of a water-based stain with a foam brush, not letting it sit on too long, and using a damp rag to just blend it in. The color here is called honey maple. Over in England, I saw a lot of wax used as the top coat, but I don't think that's really tough enough for what I have in mind for this table. So after the stain dries, I'll put on a couple coats of satin polyurethane. Now, wouldn't you agree that this is much too nice a piece to relegate to the pantry?
Norm's back after the break with another new Yankee masterpiece fashioned from white oak. Find out more in a few moments.